Welcome to our introductory lesson for our course, Geography of Bible Lands. Israel is a fascinating place, a small country, but very diverse. We're going to look at this land that God has chosen out of all the places in the world to put His people, this land called Israel. And as you read through the pages of the Old Testament, you'll undoubtedly notice that Israel, the Israelites, often had a problem with idolatry. And especially with this god, the god Baal or Baal. And knowing geography helps you to understand why they were tempted so much to depend on this idol, this false god. See, Israel is a place of marginal rainfall. And whenever the rainfall isn't sufficient for the crops, there's a famine. And so the people were tempted to take their trust off of Yahweh and direct their trust to gods like Baal, who is the storm god, the god of fertility. They looked to him to provide for them. How many of you play chess? I'm sure many of you do. And you know, you could play chess without a chessboard. It would be pretty difficult. You would instinctively know where certain pieces move, but it's so much easier if you play chess with the chessboard. And the chessboard is the land of Israel. Once you understand the land of the Bible, once you understand the playing board for the Bible, you'll be able to understand why certain events took place in certain locations, why certain battles took place where they were, and these things will start to make a lot more sense. The knowledge of the land of Israel, or biblical geography, is important for theology. Davies has said, Christian theologians are once again reclaiming the fact that the land is central, if not the central theme of biblical faith. The land theme is so ubiquitous that it may have greater claim to be the central motif in the Old Testament than any other, including covenant. Well, that's a pretty dramatic statement because a lot of Old Testament theologies have been based on the concept of covenant. So it's important to know the land of Israel. It's important from a hermeneutical standpoint as we try to understand what God is doing, especially in the Old Testament. And for the most part, the land has not changed. When George Adam Smith was in the land and he was studying it, and he was considering the activities of Napoleon when Napoleon was in the land. And he said this, the analogy and the truth of the descriptions were striking. They still fit this country after so many centuries. Well, the customs have changed, cultures changed, language has changed since Bible time. But the geography of the Bible is still essentially the same. The mountains, valleys, rivers, lakes, deserts are all still in the same place. So knowing geography will connect us with the people of the Bible. We're going to describe Israel as the land between. And it's important to know that while Israel holds a place dear in our hearts, in the scheme of things, in the ancient world, it really wasn't that significant in terms of world civilization. It's a rather small place, and it's really a place between two great empires of the ancient world. We'll see Israel is a land bridge between the continents of Europe, Africa, and Asia. So it sits right at the intersection of those three continents. And so it functioned as a land bridge between the great empires of Mesopotamia and those down in Egypt. And so if Mesopotamia wanted to go down and conquer Egypt, they had to pass right through Israel. If Egypt wanted to conquer, say, Persia or Babylon, they would pass right through Israel on the way. Israel was a land between these two great empires. The empires in Mesopotamia, like Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and down in the southwest, we have mighty Egypt. Well, when these two empires wanted to conquer each other, they would have to follow the Fertile Crescent to travel from one empire to the next, because there's a huge desert that separates the two, and so if they wanted to travel by land, they had to follow the Fertile Crescent, where water was available, where food was available. We're going to look at Israel also as a land of faith. God put Israel in this specific place for a reason. Of all the places he could have put his people, he put them in this very specific location. And the first reason God put Israel where he did was for protection from their enemies. Now, Israel needed protection because when you're living on the highway, that is the route from one empire to the next, when those invading armies pass through, of course, they're going to steal your crops, take your money, and do devastating things to your country. And so Israel was very vulnerable as these armies would pass through their land. But when Israel was obedient to the Mosaic covenant, they had God's protection from these invading armies. And when they were disobedient, that's when they got overrun by these foreign powers. The second reason why how Israel, or God, was building Israel as a people of faith was through providing for them their daily provision. And unlike Egypt, that has the Nile River, which provided water almost all the time in fertile soil when it would flood its banks every year, and in Mesopotamia, where there was the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, Israel had no real river that was accessible. The Jordan River is way down in the Jordan Valley, far from where the Israelites lived, and nobody was going to carry water all the way from the Jordan River up to the hill country. But in Egypt, it was very easy to channel that water into your fields from the Nile River and its branches and water your fields. So they had access to water for their agriculture year-round. But in Israel, it was a different story. Just a meager amount of rainfall. If there wasn't enough rain, if there was a drought, then that would cause a famine in the land. So they were highly dependent upon the Lord for rainfall. Well, the Bible assumes that the reader is familiar with the land. The biblical writers are Hebrews. They are writing to other Hebrews, and they assume that the people reading their writings grew up in the land of Israel, so they don't take the time to explain a lot of things that are related to the geography and to the land. So it's up to us to go the extra mile to learn and understand about this land so that we can understand it in the same way as the authors intended. For instance, sometimes in the Bible it refers to the armies of the north. And when you look at a map and you see where Assyria is located, or Babylon's located, or Persia, you say, that's not technically north, that's northeast. Did they get it wrong? Did they not understand geography properly? Well, they looked at things from a very functional sense. And for the Jews living in Israel, their enemies, right before they came into the land, were always coming from due north. So they weren't really thinking in terms of their original location, but when they entered the land, they would always come from the north. So thus, the armies of the north. So they would follow the Fertile Crescent and enter Israel from the north, because they couldn't really come across the arid desert. They had to follow the Fertile Crescent. Another expression that is often repeated in the Old Testament is to go up to Jerusalem. The reason why they would make that statement is because Jerusalem is higher in elevation than most places in Israel. So they were speaking in a very functional sense. Okay, we're going to go up to Jerusalem. And, one time a friend of mine, she was reading the Bible, and like many North Americans or many people in the world, they tend to think of maps where north is at the top. And so when she read about how the disciples and Jesus were going to go from Galilee down to Jerusalem, and it said they were going to go up to Jerusalem, she thought, wow, that's not correct. They should have been going down. Well, when the Bible describes that, they're simply describing it in terms of elevation. They're going to go up to Jerusalem because Jerusalem was higher than most places. And even if they did come from a place that was higher in elevation than Jerusalem, the final ascent as you approach Jerusalem, you're undoubtedly going to have to go up. And you're going to feel that in your legs, being tired, and your legs are going to tell you you're going up to Jerusalem. This slide shows Jerusalem looking from south to north, where the Dome of the Rock is, the Golden Dome. That's where the temple would have stood. And so as the pilgrims would approach the temple in ancient times, they would be going up to Jerusalem, and their legs would inform them that that is indeed the case. Israel is a small land, but it's a land of contrasts. First off, in terms of size, Israel is a rather small country compared to other countries. If we were to compare it to China, Israel is very small, only 20,000 square kilometers, whereas China is 9.6 million square kilometers. Comparing Israel to India, very small as well. And compared to the Philippines, Israel is not even as big as the island of Luzon. So Israel is a pretty small place. In terms of elevation, we have contrast as well. We have the highest point in the hill country, which is Beit Sur, and that's about 1,000 meters. And up in the far north, we have the highest place in Israel, at about 2,700 meters, is Mount Hermon, high enough to have snow on it year-round. It's a beautiful mountain, and the Israelis have even built a ski resort there because it does have snow most of the year.